Welcome to First in Fiction, your first stop for learning to write fantastic fiction. I'm your host, Aaron Gansky, author of The Bargain, The Hand of Adonai series, Who is Harrison Sawyer, uh, and First in Fiction. See, I told you I was going to mess it up. It's been one of those days. Somebody save me, Pops.
Heart song.
There we go.
We need to write those. We need to write those out for you. Yeah, my name is Alton Gansky, and I have written far too many to give you all the titles of, but book-length fiction and some nonfiction.
Molly Jo Riley, curator of the Unemployment Cookbook, the finished first draft of NOLA, and I think that's it for me right now.
So a quick reminder for those of you listening to us on the audio only, you can watch us live 6:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time every other Tuesday. You can do that on aarongansky.com. It's the best place to do it. We got a pretty decent chat room already. You can watch us live and participate with your questions and comments and engage in some good literary discussions. It's lots of fun. If you would like to contact us, you can do that at firstinfictionpodcast@gmail.com, or you can reach us at any of the social media avenues. If you're watching on YouTube, we do ask that you hit the subscribe button and the like button. It helps us out quite a bit. So if you are in the chat room, don't forget to hit the links at the top, and that shares the link with your social media friends and helps them find us so that they can listen and play along, play the home version of the game. I think I'm dating myself now. Nobody talks like that anymore, do they?
Just you.
Just me. Okay. So
your dad doesn't even sound that old.
Oh, wow. Well, if I'm old, then he's older. So that's, I've always got that. So our Ask the Author question today says this: how do you fictionalize a real place without offending anyone, especially if it's the best setting for your story? How do you make the town, city, or whatever it is that you're discussing, whatever setting that you're doing, into your own? So I think nobody's going to be offended. If you're writing about Chicago, people in Chicago are not going to be offended unless you are making mistakes talking about the Statue of Liberty in Chicago. People are going to have an issue with that. As long as you're not doing that, as long as you're respectful to the city, you do a little bit of research, figure some things out, I think you're going to be fine. If you're writing disparagingly about it, about how evil Chicago is, you might get a couple of people who are offended, but most people are going to understand that this is the character's perspective. In The Bargain, I fictionalized the town. I used the town's history, but I gave it a fictional name because one of the premises or the conceit of the novel was the fact that this town was full of evil people. And so I didn't want to offend anyone that lived in that town because that kind of been speaking ill of them. So I simply took the real history but fictionalized the name of the town, and so that people would understand I wasn't writing about this particular town. It was something different. It's really easy to do that. I mean, I'm not the first one to do that. I think of Metropolis, which is really based on New York City. DC does that. Lots of places create fictionalized towns or fictionalized versions of real towns. But for the most part, I don't think you really need to worry about offending anyone unless you're just simply not putting in the time or effort to get some of the details right. I did read a book. I'm not going to say which book. That was supposed to take place in a major American city. Never figured that out because there wasn't enough information about it. There wasn't enough detail about the setting. So I think as long as you're giving the proper amount of detail, giving the proper amount of research to it, I think you're going to be fine. Even if you say something disparaging about it, people in New York say disparaging things about people in California. People in California say disparaging things about people who live anywhere other than California. And it's just kind of something that we do. So it's I think probably going to be okay. Pops, what's your insight on that?
Yeah, my first question is, why would anyone be offended? I would imagine if the protagonist starts just bagging on a real town, everyone who lives here is a drunk and um, can't keep a job, and place would be better if it was wiped off the earth, like Sodom and Gomorrah or something like that. And it's coming across as being the writer's point of view, then I imagine you could offend somebody. But every town has its crooks and its bad guys and its red light district, but it also has a lot of good people in it. So as long as you're being honest about it and you're letting your characters do the speaking, so that you know that it's a character making this remark, you should be fine. There should never be a problem. Most readers know that it's fiction. Most readers know that the character's opinion is not the author's opinion. Though I have over the years received a couple of comments, and that's probably about it, 2, maybe 3 comments, where someone took me to task for what one of my characters thought. And, I take a few moments to explain to them what a novel was and what fiction was. And usually I want to know if they've corrected or chewed out everybody they see on television, or in a movie. So most people are smart enough to know the difference. But if you're constantly bagging on it, and let's say it's your protagonist, you might have a problem, unless he starts seeing something worthwhile. But if your protagonist is constantly tearing the place down, then they'll get pretty frustrated. But doesn't mean you shouldn't be able to talk about the rising murder rate in Detroit, or the mob affiliation of Chicago or New York. But I also think you're very right in saying if you're going to use a real town, you should do some research. If you're going to set something in New York, then you need to know the different cultural areas. A lot of people, of course, settled in New York, immigrants, and so there's a Puerto Rico place, and there's not so much a China place. There is in San Francisco, but you get all these Irish communities, Jewish communities, and so on. You need to know where they are and if any of the action takes place there, so as not to inadvertently insult somebody by not doing the proper research. But just be true to the story, be as factual as possible, without losing the story content in the process. But I really wouldn't worry about it. And the truth is, you're going to write fiction, somebody's not going to like it. It doesn't matter what it is. There's always going to be somebody who thinks it's their job to take you to task. Fortunately, there's not a great deal of that.
That's good. Sorry, my cats were banging a cabinet in the other room. It distracted me for a second. So my response to this is novels are always a blend of reality and fiction. We don't start writing from fiat. We begin with what we know. And our fictional characters are based on humanity as we know it, but we place them in situations and places we're familiar with, or based on situations and places we're familiar with. You won't always reference McDonald's or Starbucks, but if you send your protagonist to a fast food burger joint or a popular coffee house, most people will get the idea. So I think the question to ask yourself is, why do you want to fictionalize the place? Is it a historical site and your story would be unbelievable? Is your story dark and you don't want to taint the real location? So just as we create characters and situations based on our knowledge of real life, you can do the same with those places.
You can even do a conglomeration. You can have a fictional city that's, a Chicago / New York, or a Miami, Florida / Dallas, Texas, whatever it is that you want, that's fine. Come up with a new name, etc. But a lot of readers prefer their settings to be in real places. A lot of them like it if it's a fictional town. Stephen King does a lot of, he has his own fictional town that he does a lot of his novels take place in. And it's based on real towns in Maine, but it's not, I don't think, a particular town in Maine. It's just different towns in Maine. So yeah, I really think the risk of offending someone based on your setting choices is going to be low, unless, again, you're just not being respectful in the terms of doing the proper research, or aligning it from beginning to end. And I think, Pops, you make a good point about if it's a character that's maligning it, that's one thing. If it's the narrator that's doing it, it's quite another. If I write an essay about, I don't know, Minnesota, someplace in Minnesota, then that's going to be a little more offensive to the people who live there, because, especially as an outsider, soda, they're going to take offense to that. But again, fiction is fiction. Most people understand that. Pops, you said you got what, 2 or 3 letters over the course of how many years and how many
20 some odd
novels?
years, right? Yeah. And it's going to happen again. It doesn't really matter what you do. Somebody's going to find something to complain about or to correct you on. And if you write enough, you are going to make little mistakes. I did that in one of my books. I talked about there's a crime scene. I talked about blood splatter. It's actually spatter. There's no L in it, and I wasn't even aware I had done that. But they didn't take me to task about it. They just let me know. Or in one of my books, I mentioned one of the space shuttles, and we had a couple of space shuttles that began the same letter. And in mentioning one, I used the wrong shuttle name. I use it right every place else, but I use it wrong in one sentence. Well, those are human things, and they get corrected for the second edition. I want to touch on something, though, that Molly said, because she mentioned specific businesses like McDonald's and Starbucks. Now, sometimes those people will, well, I've never been contacted by any, but they don't like authors to use trademark names, Coca-Cola, Kleenex, things like that. And they used to run ads in writer magazines asking authors not to do that or to put the trademark symbol. Now, can you imagine a novel where somebody reaches for a Kleenex, and then you have Kleenex, and then in superscript you have TM? It's just, it really takes you out of the story. So writers just don't do it. And the reason they do that, and I'm just providing an additional background of something else for writers that they might find interesting, is if you have a trademark on a name, you are required by law to defend it. Otherwise, it will just go out into the public as like a public domain, and anyone can use it. And so Kleenex doesn't want people using their name without permission, because if it becomes too common, they lose their trademark. Same thing with McDonald's hamburgers. If too many people use it too often, they can lose their trademark. So sometimes what they'll do is they'll complain and say, well, see, I am defending it. And so they don't lose their trademark. But I don't know any author that puts trademark stuff in. There have been times where I've been tempted to put a page in the back, say these businesses were named and these are trademarked names, and just put it in the back of a book, but I've never done that yet. I think about it, but I haven't done it yet.
And I think a lot of that is largely on the publisher and editors to kind of identify those types of things. And when we're writing, we write and we get the job done, and then some of that business stuff I tend to let editors and publishers deal with. Pops, is that kind of your experience with it as well?
Yeah, because now we're talking about if you have traditional publishers. You're not self-publishing, but if you have a traditional publisher, they've been advised by their lawyers and stuff what they can and can't get away with. And to my knowledge, no one has really sued a publisher for using a name as a trademark infringement with it, because the author and the publisher is not using it in a sense to make money off that. So in other words, if I started a facial tissue is what Kleenex wants us to use, or used to want us to use. If I start a facial tissue company and I call it Kleenex, okay, that's a trademark infringement, and they will sue my socks off, or whatever the product might be, and they would have a right to do so. But if you mention it as a product, in a sense, you're advertising it for them. So to my knowledge, I don't think there's been any big court case. There may have been a letter or two sent out. Again, this is just my experience, and I could be wrong about that, but I keep my ear fairly close to the ground on some of these things, and I don't know of any big brouhaha on that, because the trademark is really not being infringed upon and it's not being stolen. But I understand that. So, often I won't say Coke or Pepsi. I'll just say a soda or a cola. But oftentimes I will use the proper name. I've done it with like Denny's and IHOP and, particular restaurants and stuff, because it helps set the mood. It's a way of establishing the setting. But that's a whole different thing. It's just something Molly said that got me going on that. It's Molly's fault.
It usually is. I'm okay with that.
We just blame Molly's a really good scapegoat. She's very good at that. Mm-hmm. So
Yes.
We take turns, isn't it? We take turns each podcast on who gets to be the scapegoat.
Yeah, pretty much. So I'm just reminding you that you get December.
All right, the whole month?
Sure.
Wow. All right.
Merry Christmas.
So thank you very much. So moving on to our main topic this week, we've spun the wheel of genre, and this week we land on action and adventure. So as just a quick reminder, again, genre dealing with the of literary works to which a category that we can place a novel into. This is the terminology that bookstores use when they want to put a book on a shelf. An adventure, is this a fantasy, is this a science fiction, is it speculative fiction? And so we've covered this before. Just a quick reminder that most novels are going to cross, not cross genders, as Stephen James would have us believe, but crossing genres. And so it might be an action adventure fantasy, it might be a suspense thriller horror. Some of these that kind of these novels that cross multiple different genres or have elements from different genres in them. Alternate historical suspense, all those types of things. So this week, though, that we're looking at a pretty traditional genre called action and adventure. Now, I've not written a contemporary action adventure. You could argue that all of my books have an element of action in them. I would say are definitely action and adventure. Also firmly in the fantasy category. You know who has written an adventure novels, though, is this guy that I know. I don't want to drop names, but his name is Alton Gansky.
Oh, he's good.
Hey, I ain't heard of him.
Yeah. I'm related. I mean, I hate name dropping, but I know a guy. Written quite a few of these, and I think of your works, probably the ones that most closely fit this bill would be the Perry Sachs novels, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. But you're going to be our sage on the stage this week, so I'll be lobbing some questions at you and send you the questions ahead of time so you're prepared. I do plan on going off the cuff a little bit, just off script, just to keep you on your toes. But I'll start with a softball question, one you've already seen. And that's simply this. Before we jump into our typical genre question, we don't often ask on these podcasts, and I'm a little bit sad to say that we've forgotten to ask these. One of the best can give to writers who want to write in a particular genre is to read the masters who have written the best books in these particular categories. So, Pops, what types of books and or authors should we be reading if we want to write an action adventure? Who would you consider kind of the masterpieces of this genre and the master workers of the genre?
Yeah, sure. Let's first define what we mean by action adventure genre. And as you've mentioned, see, it's already hyphenated action adventure. It's a blending of two different genres, but that's become the classification, and it's really shorthand for booksellers to be able to help people find the kind of book that they're looking for. But action adventure is a hybrid genre. It includes a lot of page-turning action combined with usually an unusual setting. And how unusual is unusual for the reader. The reason cop shows and doctor shows are so big is we usually don't work in hospitals and we're not cops. Our FBI, our military, and so those are unusual settings and workplaces for us. So it's from the reader's perspective when we talk about unusual. But who to read? You know, one of the first names that comes to me, of course, is Clive Cussler, who's made quite a career out of pure action adventure writing. And he, for the longest time, was one of my favorite writers. His earlier books, a little thin, but he was learning the craft like we all do. I don't want to be judged solely on my first book, or my second, or my third, but as time goes on, we develop a greater understanding and some depth and maturity. But he's made quite a career out of this. Tom Clancy would be another one. His is military action adventure, but you can even have, also let me mention H.J. Riker, who wrote the Silent Service series, which are submarine books. And one of our guests that we had on some time ago, Tom Morrissey, who is an adventurer himself, and he's written several adventure tales, usually dealing with scuba diving of some sort or another, and served as a source for one of my books. So those are some good people to think about. But remember now, action adventure can really have a third category. You can have a space action adventure. I mean, it's pretty much what Star Trek is kind of a space setting, but it's an action adventure kind of story. You can have medical action adventure depending where it takes place. I helped a guy with his first book who's a medical doctor, and his was an action adventure story that takes place in Africa with a doctor as a protagonist, an American doctor. So there's really plenty of them out there. It's a beloved genre, and a lot of fun to write. It has unique qualities, but I would say some of those people, Clive Cussler, especially his middle books on, I would say, all of his books as you get started, but really anything after the fourth, fifth, sixth book, his characters develop some real depth to them, become a little more three-dimensional, more emotive, easier to connect to, and has really done a great job. And I always admire somebody who continues to grow. That's not to say his first book is lousy. It's not. It's just he grows, and that's important for we writers to understand. And again, you can have political action, adventure, spy, and even, as you mentioned, fantasy. Your fantasy book really is an action adventure, but because of its setting and its fantasy quality, that's what we think of it as. We do the same with sci-fi that's action adventure. We think of it as science fiction. Michael Crichton is another good one. Jurassic Park is classic action adventure. And Michael Crichton did a lot of action adventure with technical aspects to it. That's what made him unique. Congo. If you ever get a chance to read Congo, you might want to read it. It's good. It's really dated. It has a lot of computer stuff that my iPhone is 10 times more powerful than what he had in his first book. That's how much technology has changed. But nonetheless, it was very interesting about intelligent apes and the like. So those are some good. My first book, By My Hands, is not an action adventure, but it has some qualities. But the second book, the follow-up book, Through My Eyes, is really, I always define it as supernatural suspense, but it is truly an action adventure. It takes place on several continents, has the same kind of action that you'd expect from an action adventure, and takes place in Ethiopia and the Greek Isles. And so those are some recommendations there.
Thank you. Thanks. Excellent. Would be to kind of follow up on some more of your resume, if you will, with the Perry Sachs novels, which I really enjoyed. Why don't you give our listeners a little bit about Perry Sachs and 3 novels that you wrote in that series?
Yeah, Perry Sachs. I'm smiling because I did an interview with a book club after one of the Perry Sachs books came out. He's the only character I've ever had receive a marriage proposal. One of the ladies in the club, it's in Texas somewhere, wanted to know if she could marry Perry Sachs in the next book. And I told him I couldn't speak for Perry. Perry tells me what to do. I don't tell him what to do. Perry Sachs, some of my favorite novels that I've written, he and his father head up Sachs Engineering. That's the premise of this. And it's a company that really contractors. They build buildings. But what makes them unique is that the buildings they build are often for the government. And so sometimes they're underground, they're secret facilities. They have some unique qualities about them. So he has some kind of special training in some of the weird things. And so they're connected to government things. And he gets occasionally attached to figure out some things that are going on. So I did several books for that. All of them I've republished. You can see them at my website, altongansky.com. But Treasure Deep takes place in the hills, the oak-lined hills in Southern California, near Tehachapi. Beautiful place. Beneath the Ice takes place in Antarctica. And The Submerged also takes place in the United States, but it takes place under the United States. So a lot of action adventure. He was just a great, great character. And each book, Perry and his team, and it's an ensemble cast, which really suits action adventure. I think the best action adventure has an ensemble cast. They travel to odd places and do bizarre things and encounter things that no one else would encounter. That's what makes it interesting.
Excellent. Well, Pops, you've done the Perry Sachs. You mentioned the By My Hands and Through My Eyes. One of my perennial favorites, though, J.D. Stanton. I love the J.D. Stanton series. Would those kind of fit into the same action adventure category?
Yes, but like your fantasy book, most people consider that book a fantasy, even though it has a very strong action adventure component to it. And that's the same thing with J.D. Stanton. Those are normally classified as supernatural suspense, but they are very much action adventure kinds of stories. Not in the strictest sense, at least where ship possessed. But some of the others certainly have an action adventure quality to them. So I consider them action adventure. And then the other ones I did, the military ones with Major Strucker, those are military action adventures. Those took place in Venezuela, in one of the Baltic states, different places around the world. So, but you could call that military fiction. So sometimes, a rose by any other name.
I really love that series. Now, are those still in print, or are those also available? Did you republish those? Are those available on Alton Gansky as well?
No, I didn't republish those. To my knowledge, I don't think they've released the copyright. Let me make sure that everyone who listens to this or is watching now understands this. When you work with a traditional publisher, you sign a contract and you give them the exclusive right to publish that book. Depending on the contract, the typical contract now will include print books of every sort, and will also include ebooks of every sort. And then there will be a line in there that says, "in any other media that may come along not yet thought of." So they get all the rights to that. And then what will happen is after a while, a book will go out of print, which means they're not going to print them anymore. But that doesn't mean they don't have some in a warehouse. So they'll continue to sell them. Then at some point, they will do what's called a reversion of rights. And a reversion of rights is where they give you a document. It's usually a letter saying you now have the rights back to these. So when I get a reversion of rights, my plan is to republish them because I get requests for them and they're hard to find. So now I republish them and just make them available to people who haven't read those books yet. So in those cases, with the Strucker books, the reversion of rights would go to him, not to me. So I don't know if they've been reverted or not.
Interesting stuff. Let's roll up our sleeves now, get into some of the nitty gritty. We've talked about your resume. You've got a lot of experience writing these things, reading these things. We often do an analysis of plot. What are the reader expectations? The pacing and plotting of an action adventure novel?
Well, I'm trying to look at my notes here for this. As I said earlier, the readers do have expectations. Is that what we're talking about? You wanted to talk about the reader?
Yeah, the reader expectations of plot. Like what needs to happen for it to be an action adventure novel?
Yeah, you're breaking up a little bit on my end, so it's one reason I was a little confused there. Well, as we've said, it's a broad category, so some of the expectations will vary. But here's what I think every good action adventure story should have. One is a unique setting. Now, again, unique doesn't mean distant lands. It often does. If you for a United States audience, Western world audience, something happening in Antarctica, in South America, in Africa, of course, is a distant land, and that becomes very intriguing to some people. But it should have some form of unique setting, something most readers will not have experienced. And so if you're going to write an action adventure story, what you want to do is you want to create an intriguing stage for your actors to work upon. So take Jurassic Park, for example. really all the people, almost all the people, all the major people in Jurassic Park are Americans. But all the action takes place on a South American island. And so it's a distant place. It's an unusual island. This goes back to making up a place. And so these dinosaurs are cloned there. And so that you have all this weird stuff around, and the plants that they've cloned, those sorts of things. So in Michael Crichton's case with Jurassic Park, he created a unique setting. And we want everyone who does an action adventure wants to either take a unique setting or create one. If you take one, you want to highlight certain things. So I mentioned a book I helped, I did an edit for, takes place in Africa with a doctor there. And there are certain things that he highlighted in that particular part of Africa that had to do with the story, where a band of bad guys are kidnapping people and the like is going on. He's taking that right out of the newspaper. So a unique setting, but now you need to have something else. You need to have a determined hero. Usually in action adventure, you'll have a hero who's self-sacrificing and willing to go all out, even if it's for the fun of it. But most of the time, there's something driving them. They have a high sense of nobility, a high sense of honor, and a high sense of what is right and what is wrong. Of course, there's often a problem they have to solve to save the world, save somebody's life, save a country, whatever it might be. So with Clive Cussler, he has Dirk Pitt. For Ian Fleming, it was James Bond. For Tom Clancy, initially it was Jack Ryan, and they had some other, in his later books, had another character or two. But you get the idea. There's somebody who's going to become central to all of that. So you need a determined hero. Now, here's where people start making mistakes. They think if it's an action adventure, then the hero has to be Superman. And we end up making plastic superheroes, like little action figures, who can do no wrong. You're a comic book fan, Aaron, so I know that you'll understand this. But that was one of the problems with Superman, is they made him so strong that it became difficult to put him in danger. So the early stories was, could he get there in time? Not could he solve the problem? Could he get there in time? I'll give him 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 things he has to do to save people's lives in different parts of the world, make it more difficult. And then along comes kryptonite. And then green kryptonite became red kryptonite, became yellow kryptonite, because he had to have some kind of weakness. Well, that was a problem that Schuster and the others had when they made Superman, is they made him too powerful. And so that gave them a problem later on. So you don't want to have that kind of problem with your main character. You don't want a plastic superhero. There needs to be some reality about him. Or the John Wayne syndrome. The old war movies with John Wayne, where he jumps into a foxhole and 15 of the enemy jump in after him with knives and guns and stuff, and he comes out and his hair's still combed. And he's got a little spot of dirt on his face, and all the others are dead.
That's not real?
No, that's not real. That's not real. In my books, he might defeat him, but he crawls out of that thing, and he's going to limp for the rest of his life, because he's going to take a real beating. So you need a superhero, or I should call him a superhero. You need a protagonist you can beat up, and make him sympathetic that way. And it doesn't hurt to have a character that is somehow incomplete, has some weakness, some fear, some quirk. What was Indiana Jones afraid of?
Snakes.
Snakes.
Why did it
nothing
have
else
to
frightened
be
him.
snakes?
Remember in the early, and so Spielberg does that with Indiana Jones in the beginning. One of his guides is freaking out because there's a big spider on him. He goes, "Oh, stop being a sissy." And he brushes it off, and then he sees a snake, and then he's like a little girl, a child. We all have our fears. That just makes him human. So it doesn't hurt to have a character that is somehow incomplete, or has a weakness, or a quirk, a phobia, something that makes him a little more human. And then the other thing I think that readers expect is some kind of new challenge, some kind of setback, some kind of impending danger that is multiplied through the story. So remember, the genre is called action adventure, not just adventure. So there's going to be some action.
I have a question on that, because I wouldn't say the emphasis is action adventure, but obviously that's a big part of it. You don't want to do action just for the sake of action, but if it propels the story forward, is there such a thing as too much action?
Yeah, I did a little work with one person wanted me to be one of his alpha readers, and he sent some work my way, and it was pretty bad. What made it bad was in the first 10 pages, there were 6 gunfights that he was involved in. I don't mean a gunfight that lasts 10 pages. I mean, he had 6 different ones in different places. Everywhere he went, somebody was going to shoot at him. And it just,
Wow.
he was so enamored with the action portion, that's all he wanted to write. And so I didn't have any chance to, care about the character. I was starting to root for the bad guys. Maybe they could take him out and I'd be out of this thing I have to read. Because there's no reason to care for him. So yes, you can have too much action. The action has to come out of the plot. You don't just throw action in like too much salt in cooking, or just throw an ingredient in that doesn't fit what you're baking.
Got it.
So yeah, you could have too much action, but it's just as bad not to have enough action in action adventure. So there needs to be something that happens, and usually there'll be a whole bunch of these, a chain, a string of pearls of action through the story. That help?
Very much.
Okay.
Thank you.
And then the other expectation I think people have to deal with is this high concept, this premise that's just this side of impossible. There's just no way the person can overcome this. There's no way the bad guy is just too bad, or the organization is just too tough, or there's just not enough time. It's going to be really close to impossible to do this, but somehow you have to make it happen. So it has to be believable enough that the reader will suspend disbelief while they read. So you want a big problem, whatever it might be. It doesn't have to be a meteor going to hit the earth or anything like that, but there has to be a problem for your character that's really just beyond that person's reach at the moment. And through the course of the story, they find a way to prevail.
Do you have a few examples of that, popular books that we might be familiar with?
Well, okay, let's go back to Clive Cussler's not his first book, I think it was his 4th book, Raise the Titanic. What a great premise. How are you going to raise a ship from the bottom of the ocean? It's impossible. Can't do it. Okay, and how are you going to get down there to set things up? It's too deep. So it's really an impossible scenario. Yet Dirk Pitt and his group of NUMA, what was it, National Underwater Marine Agency, and his people are going to have to figure a way out to do this and survive the attacks of the bad guys that are coming along. So what he did is he gave them an impossible situation, and what the reader wants to know is, how's he going to win? That's what action adventure is. It's going to be really too difficult to do. They're climbing the world's tallest peak. You're going to climb Mount Everest, 29,029 feet, and you need oxygen to be able to do that. Not everyone does, but let's say you do, and you're out of oxygen. So you have to be there for some reason, for someone else's benefit. Do you keep going, or do you head back down before you die? You got to find a way. By the way, Clive Cussler, that's what he always has. He always has some unique solution. He sets it up in the prologue, and it's going to come back at some point. And you wait for it, so that becomes an expectation. So this high concept, raising the Titanic, in one of my Perry Sachs books, he wants to save his father, and he has to go to a place where his father had been, a unique place, an underground base that was not built by people. That was the hook. It was not built by humans. Who was it built by? Well, that's really the question you have to deal with in the story. And the only way he thinks he can save his father is to find out what happened 25 years before in that place. And it's really just an impossible task, as I set it up. But he's got to try. And that's what action adventure is. And then I make it tough on him.
Yeah. It starts impossible, and then it gets tough.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. You've mentioned Indiana Jones a couple of times, and I think that series is really good for us to be able to look at for this action and adventure kind of a but I think it's also possible that people tend to fall into traps when they're doing a particular genre, specifically going into the cliches, things that we kind of want to avoid. But When you've mentioned doing some alpha reading and beta reading for other people writing in this category, what types of mistakes have they made? What types of mistakes do new writers make? What should we be cautious of?
Yeah, there's really several of them, and those listening will want to get the show notes at your website, aarongansky.com, because I have some of them listed there. This is a sort of a short list, but we'll go back to the example I gave of this guy who wrote an action adventure. It was really sort of a cop mystery action suspense adventure all put into the blender. That was really his first problem. He did not have a clear understanding of what it was he wanted to write. But the first big problem that I've seen is thinking that action adventure is nonstop action. It's not. You have to have a break. That's where you're going to see the emotion. That's where you're going to see the setup. That's where you get the information. That's where tension is built. That's where you have the short success and the big failure, and they have to keep going. You need those kinds of breaks with that. Even comic book writers make an effort to develop character. And they have very short amount of time in which to do that. So there's a lot of fisticuffs that go on in the comics, because that's what people want. They want that kind of action, but they also want to know the kind of problems Peter Parker has as Spider-Man, or how Captain America is haunted by the loss of his partner Bucky, and then bring him back. And all right, so you have to have some reason for all of that. Batman, he's a damaged man, and over time they made him even worse. He's emotionally crippled. In the contemporary comics of Batman, he's just not really a warm, fuzzy guy, and that's because what he endured, seeing his parents killed and the brutality he's seen his whole life. So you got to have that kind of depth. So action adventure is not nonstop action. It has a good bit of action at different levels and some adventure. The other problem that people have, the second thing would be the heroes are just too good to be true. They're just too good to be true. It's just, unbelievable. And after a while, if you cannot believe the protagonists, then the book just falls flat. In the early part, it's not like I'm picking on Clive Cussler. I'm not. I'm an admirer of his. And he influenced my action adventure. But in some of his earlier books, I traveled to, that is, my thinking and my emotion connected with his partner, Al Gradino, more than it did with Dirk Pitt, the hero, because I found him a more well-rounded person, a more believable person. Now later, Clive Cussler put some real depth into Dirk Pitt, but early on, too good to be true. James Bond is that way. That's my complaint about James Bond. Now I'm talking about the movies. James Bond, they did one where he loses his wife, and that changed everything. Okay, but prior to that, he was just too good to be true. He's too good looking.
No.
Too attractive to women.
He's never too good looking. Okay, let's just clear that up right now.
He's too strong. He gets all the breaks. All the evil guys want to pause the torture so they can explain themselves to him, giving him time to get out. There's just no realism in it. And that really leads to the third thing. The heroes are too emotionally shallow. Don't have emotionally shallow. Give them some complexity. Best heroes are complex. Well, let's use another comic book thing. For some reason, I'm thinking comic books tonight. The Hulk is one. Okay, he's a complicated character. He's full of rage, and he's not real happy about it, which makes him full of rage. So he's in this cycle, but he has a lot of emotion to it. So that's true in the books. Make them emotionally vulnerable at times. I mean, they have to weep at a sad movie or something, but show a complete person. What other traps are there? Presenting a problem that's too easy to solve. Remember, in good writing, especially in action adventure, we'll talk about this a little bit more. The antagonist must be bigger, badder, stronger than the protagonist. This is the Popeye Bluto thing. The reason Popeye doesn't beat up Wimpy for asking for money, I'll pay you back Tuesday for a hamburger today, is Wimpy's too sympathetic, too soft. He's not a challenge. He's not a danger. Bluto, the big guy, is what, 2.5 times the size of Popeye. So when he whips up on Bluto, he's a hero. If he whips up on Wimpy, he's just a brute. He's an animal. So it would make him pretty shallow too. So presenting a problem that's too easy to solve is also one of these others, and I was headed down that road. Really the problem needs to be too much for them. There's just no way they're going to win. You know they're going to win when you're writing it, but it must seem to the reader that I cannot figure out how they're going to win this. All is lost, but he keeps going. And then the last one for this is a lack of high stakes. No high stakes means no great loss should the protagonist fail. And that's one thing people fail to do in their books is they don't ask the question. They ask the what if question. What if we did this? They will ask the next question, what's next? But what the question they don't ask is what happens if my protagonist fails? And that's for every genre. In action adventure, it's usually something terrible.
Really, you mentioned high stakes, and I think, I don't know if we've taken a lot of time to explain that. It feels like it's self-explanatory, but it's this idea that if your character fails, what do they lose? What does the world lose? The world falls into the hands of Sauron, overshadows the land. Or this company that has invested billions of dollars into this project ends up losing it, and now the other nation has control of the most powerful weapon in the world. Those types of things. It's not always world domination, but sometimes it is. The lack of the high stakes in the Indiana Jones movies are going to be these powerful artifacts that are being used by evil people with evil intentions, and it's always Indiana Jones against the world, and so those are high stakes. One of the ways, this isn't in the show notes, this is a bonus, maybe I'll put it in, maybe I won't, you don't know, it pays to pay attention. One of the ways manage difficult for your character is by removing resources. And so one of the ways that you can kind of find that your character take away some of their resources. If they're wealthy at the beginning, have them go bankrupt. If they have friends at the beginning, have their friends leave them. Whatever it is, whatever resources they begin with can make the challenge greater for your protagonist is by removing some of those resources. And Pops, you mentioned this, the fact that the problem is too big, the character can't do it on their own, there's no way accessible. One of the ways that you can solve that is by resources. They find resources, they become resourceful. Pattern kind of play out. What those resources are vary from book to book, movie to movie. What resources are taken away, again, really the character and what they have at the outset. But as you were talking about that, that's something that occurred to me, is the use of resource management for your characters, who kind of takes a little bit more to get your character into a little bit more. You mentioned ways to pitfalls that we need to avoid. What advice do you have for us to avoid these particular pitfalls?
Yeah, sure. I'll just list these quickly because I've touched on them a little bit, but they will also be in the show notes as our clock just keeps ticking away here. So let me say again, make your problem bigger than your hero. Okay, of course we want to have something at stake, but the problem needs to be bigger than your hero. And yet your hero is still dedicated enough for some reason to try to solve it. Again, make the antagonist more powerful and resourceful than your hero. I love an evil antagonist. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they have to be physically stronger. One of the most frightening antagonists I had was a woman doctor who was going to unleash mosquitoes. They were going to create a mass epidemic that her pharmacy company had the cure for. and she was a bad woman. She scared me, which is another thing. If you're writing action adventure and you're writing a bad antagonist, your antagonist probably should put the fear of God in you.
Hmm.
If your antagonist doesn't scare you, then it's probably not going to scare the reader. Take your hero out of his or her element. So if your hero is really good at one thing, as you said, take away some of the resources, but put them someplace where it is totally foreign to them. So in one of the Perry Sacks, I have him in Antarctica. He's never been to Antarctica, and he's going to go beneath the ice. He's going to go to, there's many lakes under Antarctica, the largest being Lake Vostok. And I wanted to send him to Lake Vostok. I wanted him to go down a 2-mile hole in the ice into Lake Vostok. That was just the image that was in my head with that. No one's ever done that. And Perry Sacks had never done that. But he ends up being in that kind of situation. So he's out of his element. Do that to your hero. Imagine the worst thing that could happen if the protagonist fails, and then make it worse. Don't take the first thing that comes along. Imagine what's the worst thing that could happen, then make it worse. Remember, the reader will be drawn to a hero more than to the action. And that's one of the other mistakes people make. They think, well, they're here for the action. They're there for the hero. They're there for the people. And they want to see how the people deal with the action, with the adventure. So to me, character is everything. Make an unbelievable premise believable. People will believe almost anything in a story if you make it plausible. It might really be impossible, but as you're presenting it, they'll give you the benefit of the doubt that maybe, just maybe, this could happen. So in one of the Perry Sacks, Submerged, there is, again, this underground base that was built, but not by humans, and it's under a lake. So that's really kind of an odd place to put this. How do you get to it? And there was just all kinds of stuff for me to figure out. But that was the job. Make it bad on yourself. You'll make it bad on your character, which will make it more interesting for your reader. And the other thing I would say is avoid easy solutions. Make it tough on yourself and everyone else. I usually come up with a scenario that's impossible to win, and then I spend hours figuring out how my character is going to win it anyway. And I've had sleepless nights. How am I going to fix this? Okay, this is what I set up, and I do that intentionally. I want it to be impossible. Then I have to figure out a way to make the impossible possible. So there's a few ideas there, Aaron.
I appreciate that. Like you say, our clock is ticking. There's several good questions left, but I want to kind of get to one about character. And the next one asks about how we can kind of craft, skip that question, because I think information out there about how to put together an action adventure hero, and they're going to say some of the same things that you say here. I feel like your answer is a little more thorough. Again, if you're looking for the show notes, you can find it at aarongansky.com, hopefully tomorrow morning, if not by tomorrow afternoon for sure. And one of the things has to do with giving them a certain skill set or talent, making them very capable in some regard, but then also having some sort of flaw. Followed this to the letter, we're all going to end up with the same character, a Dirk Pitt or a Jack Ryan, etc. Do you have to an action adventure character, but one that is unique, one that is different, that's not just kind of the stereotypical hero, but one that's going to really stick with a reader for years?
Yeah, several things. I like to give them an interesting or an unusual background. So with the Perry Sacks one, he's an engineer. Yeah, he's MIT trained, so he's very bright. He's resourceful, but he's not the guy you think of as being a great hero. He is a great hero, but he doesn't think of himself that way. He just solves problems, sometimes in very unusual ways. Along with he and his team. Again, that's an ensemble cast. With J.D. Stanton, the ship possessed, one of my favorites, Out of Time, where he encounters, he's taking a bunch of teenagers on a ocean camping trip on a catamaran, and they end up in a fog, and a dreadnought sails up upon them. One that he knew, he's a naval historian, that had been scrapped many years before, yet he's looking at it now. Okay, that's a very unique background. Former submarine captain, naval historian. Most of us don't have that kind of experience. So give them an unusual or an interesting background, or an unusual job. Make it kind of interesting, whatever it might be. Again, if we go back to Clive Cussler, Dirk Pitt works for an organization that does underwater research. So he does a lot of stuff underwater. I used to jokingly call him the wet James Bond. Same kind of character, but just very different background and kind of work. And I think it's important to give them a unique weakness of some sort, or failing, or tragedy. Remember Sherlock Holmes? That's not action adventure, but everybody will know this. Sherlock Holmes had a drug addiction, and he was uncomfortable around women. He was always the smartest guy in the room, unless his brother was there. But one of the smartest people in the world, most insightful people in the world, just doesn't handle being around women, and he was drug addicted. 7% solution. So you give him something. It doesn't have to be a drug addiction. It could just be insecurity, loneliness, loss. It can be any number of things. Give him one of your own weaknesses and apply it to your character. So those are several things there.
I would also add, and it's a great list. Thank you. The idea, you say a unique weakness or failing or tragedy. You mentioned Sherlock Holmes' drug addiction. Back to the idea that every happy family is happy in its own way. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its different way. Meaning, a lot of writers who want to write with the drunk father that beats up on him. It sounds callous for me to say. It doesn't really hit me. Choice of words. And on a reader, it just seems like it's so overdone, and the drunk and always yelling, and there's no build up to it. There's nothing like that. So if you read Hart's song, his character has a drunk father, but he's not necessarily abusive. He's not physically abusive. His abuse comes out in a very different way. So it's a little bit different. If you take a weakness or a failing or a tragedy that is common, describe it in a new and unique way. You can't say, well, Sherlock Holmes is drug addicted, so my character can't be drug addicted. Well, if that's what you feel like your character, if that's the flaw that your character has, he's probably not going to be addicted to the same drug. It's not going to affect him the same way that the drugs affected Sherlock Holmes, etc. You also mentioned what I think is great. Sherlock Holmes is always the smartest man in the room unless his brother is there. What kind of insecurity does that breed? I remember speaking with a student one time who was winning all sorts of state awards, academic awards here and there, just collecting them. And I was like, oh, you must be really proud. And she's like, yeah, but you look at my sister, she's winning national awards and international awards and all this kind of stuff. And it's just like, oh, okay. So it's Sherlock and Mycroft, and it is Mycroft, isn't it?
Yes.
Dave, okay, good. Dave would have a fit if I got that wrong. So Dave's in the chat room. That's about all the time that we have for today. I spoke a little bit too long. The rest of your answers, your wonderful answers, insightful answers, Pops, will be on aarongansky.com tomorrow. Molly, there are a couple questions, I believe, from the chat room, and there's definitely an announcement that I think warrants a quick mention.
Yes, I am super pleased. If I had bells and whistles and fireworks to go off, I would set them. Becky Lindsay signed the contract today for not just her first book, but for a trilogy series. I am so proud of her. Round of applause for Becky. Yay! Go Becky. Okay, questions. She was asking Al, how long does it usually take for a reversion of rights? Then there was some discussion on it between Dave and Vin, but we'd like to know what you have to say.
Yeah, I don't know that there is an average. I did some books a long, long time ago, and they have never reverted the rights, and they probably won't. There is no requirement that a publisher revert the rights unless you get that in the contract. And usually that doesn't end up in a contract. Especially back then, I was still fairly new. I think it was, it was like my third book and fourth book. I was just happy to be published. I don't know if I'll ever get the rights back. I might. Sometimes it'll be in the contract that you have to request them, or your agent has to request them. They won't revert them automatically. But some of the publishers I've worked with have been very good about saying, okay, it's out of print. We sold what we have. Here you go. All your rights are back. Some won't do that unless you ask them to do it. Now, maybe that they don't have the staff to take care of it. I don't know. But there's no average amount of time.
Okay.
But the beautiful thing is in our environment, the 21st century writer now is if you do get a reversion of rights, then you self-publish it. And the way I do it, and I've been thinking about doing a little series on this, little video series on this, is I take the printed book because it's been edited and I have it scanned. Now, the scanning will put errors into it, so you have to know what to look for. But and then I go back over it and clean it up a little bit more and bring it a little bit more up to date. But you want to keep those things alive. Yeah. So I hope that answers their question.
I believe it does. Becky says, thanks everyone. She's happy to be published, but she's also nervous.
That'll go away.
Yeah, the longer you're in this business, you'll learn that just gets worse. So
yeah, you got a lot of looking forward to do. It gets better with each subsequent book. So each book has its own little nervousness. So
does it?
Pull back the curtain here a little bit. Let me pull back the curtain a little bit here. Most writers I know, their number one fear is I just sent the book in and now they'll know that I can't write.
Yeah, that would be me. Yes.
It's a great insecurity.
Still waiting to hear from people. And
I wonder, will I be a one book wonder? I'm not even sure I was a wonder, but that was my first thought. Would I be a two book wonder? I've done 50 books. Will I be just a 50 book wonder?
Stop already.
It never stops. You always feel insecure. It's creativity.
Thanks for making my one book, compared to your 50. What do you have to be insecure about?
Changing industry for one.
That was a rhetorical question.
Okay. Yeah, you don't want me to answer the rest of it, so.
No. Last announcement is Al is now on Instagram. Yay!
Ooh.
So he is Gansky Alton. One word, GANSKYALTON. And he doesn't have enough followers. So you guys need to go on Instagram and follow him.
I get about your homework. About 15 a day or so. I just dabbling my toes in it right now.
Aaron is also on Instagram as Aaron Gansky, and he has an Instagram account. How often do you use your Instagram account, Aaron?
A road trip or not. So
yeah.
But that is all the time that we have. I was going to mention, Pops, one last thing. Somebody, I can't remember who it was, but somebody mentioned Perry Sachs meets J.D. Stanton. Ear and let you think about that for a little bit, for at least 2 weeks, perhaps 2 weeks. Anyhow, all for joining us. Be here again in a couple of weeks when we continue our genre focus. And it should be horror, but we may kind of rearrange some things. We may kind of change some stuff up. So keep an eye on social media, and I'm sure Molly will tell you. In the meantime, don't forget to ask the author. You can do that at aarongansky.com or on any of our social media sites. You can find Pops at altongansky.com and Molly Jo at frankly-my-dear-mojo.com. So thank you all for listening, and until next week,